Hello again. It's your boy here to do some learning. Today we're going to be talking about blockchain and cryptocurrency, a space that's very much front and center in popular media these days. What the hell is a blockchain and why is it such a big deal? What does that have to do with cryptocurrency? What exactly is Bitcoin and should I get me some? We'll be getting into that and more today, including how to get your hands on some cryptocurrency if you should be so inclined. Just so we're clear, we're going over the basics here in terms of technology and terminology. There's definitely an ocean of depth beneath everything we talk about today. And even though this video is mad long, we're really just taking a surface tour here. Before we start, just a quick disclaimer that I am not a financial advisor, and this is purely educational material. Always do your own research. That being said, let's jump right in. Section 1, blockchain structure. So the first thing we're going to have to explain here is the very concept of a blockchain. To do that, we'll start with some really basic business concepts. Let's say that we have a small business that sells widgets. Novel example here, I know, but sue me. The sale itself, of course, entails you giving the customer however many widgets they want in return for however much money they cost. Pretty simple. Now, on top of this, depending on what kind of business you may have all manner of other expenses and or streams of revenue. Maybe you don't just sell widgets, you also service and repair those widgets for your customers when needed. Maybe you insure those widgets. Maybe you run a brick and mortar shop for which you have a fixed amount of overhead, which might include electricity costs, various utility costs other than that, and property taxes, etc. You probably want to keep track of all this, right? In fact, you're likely legally obligated to keep track of a lot of these, as you're going to want that information on hand come tax time. And if you're a publicly traded company, your balance sheet, a good bit of detail about your operations, are going to need to be readily accessible as you'll be reporting your financials during your earnings calls, and the SEC won't be happy if you lie or mislead to investors. A short story here is that businesses have to keep track of their transactions, and those transactions are a part of the larger business. The larger the business, the more they have to keep track of. This is what brings us to the idea of a ledger. Basically, you write the shit down. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the transactions themselves, as that's mainly what blockchains are used for these days. You might be asking yourself why we even mention those other aspects outside of the transactions if we're not going to be focusing on them. Like I said, we'll be getting to that part a little later. Blockchains and what they're used for are evolving by the day. So back to trading widgets for money. I give widget and receive money. We reduce the number of widgets in my inventory by 1 and add $1 to my gross revenue. Now, note that this $1 might come in the form of cash, or some fiat currency, or it might come in the form of credit. Both cases involve some intermediary, like a bank or PayPal or Cash App, etc. So then where are the details of that transaction recorded? There's a few options when it comes to ledgers, and it usually depends on what kind or size of business is doing the selling. One thing that might have jumped into your mind when I started talking about this is probably something along the lines of Microsoft Excel. And that's one option, a spreadsheet. That's nice if you're an individual or small group of people. For businesses operating on a larger scale, that's unlikely to be enough. When we're talking about those large organizations, we're typically thinking about databases. These are fundamentally designed differently because they're designed to be accessed by multiple individuals and store multiple types of information that can be filtered and manipulated easily. Usually that's going to require multiple powerful server computers working in a network. An important thing to note about these servers is that they are owned by a single entity and are thus centralized, so to speak. Going back for a moment to the issue of how transactions are carried out, which I touched on seconds ago, most electronic business transactions are carried out with some form of intermediary. I'm going to go ahead and read a section of the Bitcoin white paper that lays out this issue better than I possibly could, and we'll pick through it and simplify the words of the great Satoshi Nakamoto. Completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible, since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. The cost of mediation increases transaction costs, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small casual transactions. and there's a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. With the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. Merchants must be wary of their customers, hassling them for more information than they would otherwise need. A certain percentage of fraud is accepted as unavoidable. These costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency. But no mechanism exists to make payments over a communications channel without a trusted party. Basically, the fact that there's a third party involved imposes some inherent restrictions on how transactions are carried out. That third party is going to have fees, and that's going to raise costs. If baseline cost to carry out a transaction is higher, then why on earth would I sell something that doesn't cost enough? So say, hypothetically, that PayPal charges a $1 fee to make a certain transaction happen using a MasterCard number. Why then would I use that service to sell my $1 widget? That doubles the cost of my widget by default if I were to keep my profit margins the same. And if the intermediary is responsible for the possibility to reverse a transaction, then the onus then goes to the seller a bit in order to ensure that there's no reason to reverse the transaction and cut into their margins. The customer might not like having to do more in the way of proving their financial, and that might deter some people. If reversing a transaction is even possible, it becomes harder to accept e-pay for irreversible services like, say, surgery, as any significant rate of reversal, for instance related to fraud, would potentially be a big hit. We go back to Satoshi one more time. What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. Transactions that are computationally impractical to reverse would protect sellers from fraud, and routine escrow mechanisms could easily be implemented to protect buyers. In this paper, we propose a solution to the double spending problem, using a peer-to-peer distributed timestamp server to generate computational proof of the chronological order of transactions. The system is secure as long as honest nodes collectively control more CPU power than any cooperating group of attacker nodes. Don't worry too much about the technobabble at the end of that. We'll go over it a little later. The basic idea here is just that the huge opportunity for improving e-commerce is removing the need for third parties. On top of that, the mechanism we use to do this needs to be secure enough that we can trust it to verify and enable transactions consistently. He also brings up the so-called double spending problem, which we'll hear about a couple times in this video. If you have $30 in the bank, you can't withdraw $60 just by clicking transfer twice or otherwise playing with the system. Alternatively, you can't use an amount of fiat currency with a debit or a credit card multiple times to fraudulently pay for something you otherwise couldn't afford, which could lead to a transaction that has to be reversed. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general, at the very least, need to offer a solution to this problem, and that solution is blockchain. Blockchains are like server ledgers, but they are structured in unique ways. Let's start by breaking down the word itself. Blockchain, a portmanteau of block and chain. At its most basic, this word actually describes the structure of a blockchain. The basic unit is a block, and a block is a list of records. A block, or collection of information that we're going to put into our ledger, typically consists of a few standard elements: data, hash, previous hash, and metadata consisting of a timestamp and block number. In short, these blocks of information are then chained together and distributed to every node in the network that comprises the chain. I just listed a bunch of stuff that you're not probably, you're familiar with the terminology, so let's go into detail on some of that. What we were describing before, I gave you one widget for $1, is the data I want on the blockchain. Those other elements, hash, previous hash, metadata, are what allow me to assign that data a unique home on the blockchain. Say that I have my own blockchain, widget chain, and the so-called Genesis block, the first block on the chain, is that one widget for a $1 transaction. This block will have what's called a hash. What is a hash? It's essentially a unique string of characters that functions as an identifier for the data on that block. It's literally something like this. That, by the way, is the actual hash of a block on the Bitcoin blockchain. Why do we use hashes? The process of hashing is actually a cryptographic operation that takes the data we're putting on the blockchain and outputs a specific string. Some basic features of a hash are radical uniqueness, my term. Each output is unique, and changing a little of the input changes the whole output. Consistency, the same output is always produced for a single input, and unidirectionality, so because you can't get the input back out by using the output hash. You could theoretically do this with the entire data content of the internet. So as we said, each block will have its own hash, and the hash of its so-called parent block, which came before it. If you wanted to change data in that second block, you'd also have to change the parent block as well. Also, the block's metadata and previous hash can actually be inputs alongside its own data to generate its hash. This is important to understand, as this is part of how blockchains become trustworthy over time. It would be easy to change things if there were only a few blocks, but once we get to where, for instance, Bitcoin is right now, where it's approaching 685,000 blocks, it becomes highly impractical, if not impossible, to actually change the information in the chain. The metadata also plays a part insofar as it tells us, chronologically, when that block was verified and brought onto the chain and which number block it is. For now, we'll stick to those basics, but know that there's a lot of stuff below this surface level of explanation, like how verification can be done more efficiently, utilizing Merkle trees, etc. I may make a video delving into some of that stuff later, but this isn't really the place for it. Short story here. Hashes are required for a block to be considered valid on the blockchain, and there should be a clear line of hashes leading all the way back to the Genesis block on the chain. You might be wondering at this point what Bitcoin's Genesis block consists of. Here it is. The data basically says that the Times, January 3rd, 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. And this is the hash. And pretty much note that this isn't even a transaction, just a string of texts. We'll come back to that point. Blockchains are decentralized/distributed, immutable, high capacity, consensus-based, private/pseudonymous, and highly secure. When it comes right down to it, these other factors come together to make a blockchain secure. So everything we're talking about contributes to security in some form, and beyond that, individual cryptocurrencies will have their own unique security measures on top of these basics. One term that you're likely to hear if you look up blockchains is decentralized. Remember how we said traditional databases are centralized? The simple explanation here is exactly what you're likely thinking already. The blockchain is distributed across multiple computers. Ideally, these things are large networks, and copies of the blockchain exist in each participating computer or node in the network, right? Not all blockchains are truly decentralized, but a lot of the major ones, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, are. Each node or computer in the network that participates in the blockchain can use the other nodes to correct itself, and the chain of information with the largest amount of consensus is considered correct by the algorithm. This concept can be paired with the progressive immutability characteristic we described earlier when we went over hashes. You could potentially get enough computing power to change every block's data at once. But in a decentralized network with copies of the legitimate blockchain information, even if you did that, you wouldn't be able to corrupt the chain, as there's a bunch of other computers that know the real story. The protocol will check for updates, pinpoint the error, and your attack attempt is foiled. Now, you could conceive of a situation as well where not only have you changed every block, you've also gathered enough computing power to constitute a majority, or 51% of the blockchain's power. And then you could potentially make changes with impunity. This is called a 51% attack, and we'll go over that in our section about how to attack the blockchain in part 2. The distributed nature of blockchains are a big part of what contributes to their high capacity. Simply having a system working on 1,000 computers each with their own capacity, each contributing that capacity to the network, is much more powerful than any single computer working alone. The privacy aspect of blockchains is also very important. When implementing this in the form of cryptocurrencies, this aspect is variably emphasized. Some cryptocurrencies like Monero are designed around privacy and anonymity. For the most part, cryptos like Bitcoin are not fully anonymous, but are private, as transactions typically are associated with an individual's public key instead of their personal identity information. This provides a measure of disconnection between the user and the transaction they've put on the public ledger, which itself is transparent and visible to all. The sale of 1 ounce of cocaine for $50 worth of Bitcoin can get put out on the chain, but it isn't you that sold that snow. It was the individual holding a certain public key, which is a string that superficially resembles a hash. We'll talk more about public and private keys later when we talk about cryptocurrency and the implementation of blockchains for transactions. Now, the last big concept we'll go over in this section is the concept of consensus. How do we decide that a certain block of data is legit and should be added to the blockchain? In a centralized system, whoever owns the system or is in charge of making these changes pretty much is in charge of adding data. In a blockchain, there might be thousands or hundreds of thousands of nodes, and no individual one of them is in charge of adding the next block. So how does it get done? How does everybody agree on which version of the blockchain to use without using a third party? Well, there's typically some form of what's called a consensus mechanism, a way of proving the majority of the network that this block we want to add is legitimate. And there's many of these, in fact. We'll detail these shortly in the next part on current cryptocurrency. In brief, new blocks in most blockchains or cryptocurrencies are added either by performing a great deal of cryptographic work that makes it impractical and expensive for bad actors to intervene, which is called proof of work, or by putting a certain amount of crypto coins that you own on the line to participate in adding new blocks to make it expensive and self-defeating for bad actors to intervene, which is called proof of stake. If that doesn't really make sense yet, don't worry. We'll expand on these ideas in part 2, as I was saying, as these are pretty important properties of what makes many cryptocurrencies what they are. For now, we just need to be clear on the idea that if we've gone to this much trouble to avoid having to trust the other party, making everything public, using hashes to verify blocks, decentralizing the whole network, etc., we can't mess up when it comes to adding new blocks to the blockchain. The two main kinds of strategies that networks have leveraged are the cryptographic and game theory routes, like I was saying. You either make things extremely complicated and work-intensive to mess with, or you impose a condition of participating in block verification such that any damage you do onto the blockchain, you also do onto your own wallet. The number of blocks linked in a blockchain constitutes the height of that blockchain. Each individual block has a block number or block height, which signifies its distance from the genesis block, which is block 0. Okay, last thing we're going to get into in this section is the concept of keys, a concept that's central to understanding how we transact with and move around cryptocurrencies. Private keys and public keys. A private key in crypto is a 256 megabyte number that allows coins to be unlocked and sent. So private keys are mostly about sending. This number allows you to move coins out of your wallet. That's why you got to keep them private. You keep it private because, like I said, without that number, nobody, including you, can take money away from where you keep it. Public keys are like that, except they allow your coins to be locked and received. Your crypto is going to have both private and public keys. Now, here's the relationship between them. You can derive a public key from a private key, but not the other way around. This is achieved by a complex cryptographic means that I, frankly, am not specialized enough to understand or explain. Apparently, there's a cryptographic function involving something called the SECP256K1 elliptic curve that allows the generation of these keys using randomly selected points on the curve. Don't worry about that. You really just have to be familiar with how to use these. When you make a crypto wallet and they give you a sequence of random words that they'll tell you to write down and never show anybody, that sequence of words is basically functioning as a seed input to allow the algorithm to generate your unique wallet address, which functions just like key generation. Those words are like the word equivalents of private keys. You may have heard the phrase, "not your keys, not your coins," popularized by Andreas Antonopoulos. Now, he was actually referring specifically to Bitcoin, but this is a pretty popular concept. Now, let's take a second to explore that. The type of situation that this refers to is like with exchanges like Coinbase or indirect systems like the current setup of Robinhood Crypto. Robinhood Crypto isn't currently like other exchanges that allow you to export coins to other exchanges or your own wallets. Basically, if you buy crypto on Robinhood, you're really just buying a stake in their stockpile of coins. They have a stockpile, and if you have $100 worth of Dogecoin, you kind of own the value of however many coins that money got you. Currently, you can only take out the value in the form of fiat currency and are unable to move that to other exchanges or wallets or pay for anything with it, thus eliminating opportunities for things like crypto arbitrage or staking, at least directly anyway. Robinhood Crypto is only for speculation at the moment, but they do say they want to make it a fully functional crypto wallet as soon as possible, whatever that means. Part of the fundamental philosophy of cryptocurrency is to take power away from centralized authorities. When you don't have the private keys that you identify your own coins with and allow you to send and receive your own coins, we'll talk more detail about that later, you are allowing someone else to hold your money, and that requires trust and introduces new risk. If they get hacked, you can lose your money. If they go down for maintenance or otherwise freeze trading for some reason, you lose control at a potentially inopportune time. So all that sounds pretty darn good, right? Well, it is. But there's disadvantages and challenges too, and the video wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about those as well. So here we go. First, a drawback to proof-of-work consensus coins is that work, measured in hash rate, is what is needed to add new blocks. What is needed to prove work? Energy. So as the blockchain gets higher, there's more work involved in validating the next block. More work means more energy. And where this energy comes from has been the source of much hullabaloo lately. If you've been paying any attention to news in the crypto space lately being May 2021, you're definitely going to hear about how Elon Musk dissed Bitcoin for driving a massive rise in non-renewable energy use. Now, there's more to that particular issue than what he's saying, but that gets back to what we're talking about here. Proof of work requires progressively more work, and therefore more energy over time to keep raising the blockchain higher. And so they specifically present an energy barrier. Later in the video, we'll go over how proof of stake potentially provides an answer to this, and allows some cryptos like Algorand and Cardano to aim for carbon neutrality and even carbon negativity. Given that proof of work is, at the moment, technically the most time-tested and battle-proven secure consensus mechanism in many people's eyes, many have criticized this approach as trading off security from a technical standpoint. Next, when it comes to using blockchains as infrastructure for transactions, their speed often tends to be an issue, more so with earlier generation blockchains or cryptos. For example, Bitcoin can only handle 7 transactions per second, or TPS. Its block time, the time it takes to add a new block to the chain, is about 10 minutes. In other words, if you want to go to a store and buy something with Bitcoin in person, you gotta wait 10 minutes to finalize that. In comparison, Visa can handle 1,700 TPS, and MasterCard can handle about 5,000. Your credit card doesn't take 10 minutes to work for a reason. Now, that's using Bitcoin as an example. Various other coins have their solutions to this problem, but often this comes at the expense of their decentralization. Currently, crypto cards with companies like Visa aren't actually cards that are letting you spend Bitcoin or something like that directly at the store. Crypto credit cards are essentially just regular credit cards that offer crypto instead of fiat rewards. Unfortunately, some of the ones available don't necessarily award you in one of the more valuable cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So there's that. Crypto debit cards are prepaid cards that can be loaded with crypto that's first converted into fiat currency like the US dollar. A lot of these come with proof of stake requirement, though, so watch out for that. One thing that's pointed to pretty often about cryptocurrency is the fact that a lot of it is used for illicit activity. As of 2019, the ratio of dollars used for illicit activity to Bitcoin used for illicit activity, according to Masari, was 800 to 1. According to the DEA, between 2013 and 2018, only about 10% of Bitcoin specifically was used for illicit activity like buying drugs. Your money is already used for illicit activity and in higher volumes. That's all I'm really going to say on the matter, is this just strikes me as an overtly weak argument. Who cares? Now, you may have noticed that solving some of these problems sometimes involves trade-offs with other aspects of blockchain technology that investors are drawn by, although I'll note that this isn't always necessarily the case. This bind has been characterized by some, originally Vitalik Buterin? I don't know how to say that name, of Ethereum founder fame, as the blockchain trilemma. The three competing interests of the trilemma are scalability, decentralization, and security. How should we think of and measure these things? Decentralization manifests in many ways. We can look at things like number of miners, number of full nodes, geographic distribution, number of active developers, etc. It keeps the blockchain resistant to censorship. Scalability, kind of like it sounds, is about blockchains maintaining performance in the face of mass adoption. No one using a blockchain that crumbles the moment people start actually using it is actually going to be happy with that blockchain. This is seen as maximum throughput measured by transactions per second. Security is about the irrevocability of transactions. An ideal blockchain for everyday use, en masse, is one that scales to support thousands of transactions per second while being extremely hard to attack or enact fraud upon, and at the same time maintaining complete decentralization. Why is this such an issue? Earlier, when I mentioned that Bitcoin now only supports 7 transactions per second, many of you may have been confused. That doesn't really seem like a lot, and a 10-minute block time seems overtly suboptimal if we were to ever use it as a currency. Was this a fundamentally technical issue that they couldn't overcome? Well, not really. In fact, the decision to slow things down was intentional, a way of allowing for multiple miners to verify each transaction as a trust-minimizing measure. This was a case of scalability being sacrificed for decentralization. Now, remember earlier we said work was measured in hash rate? The more hash power a proof-of-work blockchain has, the more secure it is, as the more energy is actually used to verify new blocks. If the hash rate goes up, security goes up. And at the same time, because we're generating new hashes for blocks faster, speed and thus scalability also go up. So in general, the idea is that scalability and security are directly proportional to each other, but inversely proportional to decentralization. A big reason why Visa and MasterCard systems are so fast is simply that they are centralized third parties, and that double spending issue we introduced near the beginning just isn't a big deal to them. With their central authority and the knowledge and power that come with that, they can make their networks run very quickly. However, this requires us to trust them and exposes us to counterparty risk in large numbers if ever someone were to attack them, hence the introduction of cryptocurrency. We're going to revisit this shortly in the crypto part's Ethereum subsection when we talk about gas fees, as this is essentially why they've run into a scalability issue as they continue to prioritize decentralization. In order to deal with growing adoption and thus network demands in a proof-of-work environment, the most obvious solutions typically involve reducing the number of miners verifying a given transaction, which would compromise decentralization, or reducing block time, usually by requiring less work and thus compromising security. Bitcoin's scalability answer is a layer 2 solution called Lightning, and Ethereum is basically overhauling everything to address this, switching to proof of stake and introducing all manner of complicated shenanigans like sharding and the beacon chain. More on those when we talk about specific cryptocurrencies.